So good evening. Good to see you back with us again as we continue our series in understanding the New Testament. And as we've begun, we've been dealing, of course, with the Gospels. The first four books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, and now we're dealing with Luke. And as we've been going through, we've been kind of answering a question, haven't we, as to, okay, all four Gospels deal with the earthly ministry and life of Christ. Why do we need four when one would be sufficient? And we've been finding out as we've been going that basically what's happening with these four Gospels is we see the life of Christ shared from four different perspectives. We saw the perspective of Matthew, right, where he's dealing with the life of Christ and his original readers being the Jews, right, talking about the king. And then we talked about Mark and his original readers, right, probably wrote his gospel in Rome, talking to the Roman reader, writing to the Roman reader, and his perspective of the earthly ministry of Christ. Remember, the Romans were people of action. That's why his book is quick, immediate, fast, not a lot of detail. Now we get into the Gospel of Luke, a different perspective again, as we deal with the life of Christ. And what's interesting about the Gospel of Luke is this would be the longest book of the New Testament, not just the Gospels, but this is the longest book of the New Testament. And some of you might be surprised by that because you're thinking, well, I thought Revelation would be. Oh, Revelation's only 22 chapters. Luke's 24, right? So we're talking about the longest book of the New Testament, and of the four Gospels, this is the one that gives us the most comprehensive detail about the earthly ministry, the life and ministry of Christ. Now, what Matthew and Mark did not do, what we're going to find tonight, and as we go on into the Gospel of John the next night that we're together, Luke and John are the two Gospel writers who state in the biblical text itself the purpose behind their writing. When we go a little further on tonight, we'll see the purpose behind Luke's writing. Next time we're in John, we'll see where in the biblical text he talks about his purpose. So what Luke and John do for us that Matthew and Mark do not is give us a little better idea as to why they wrote what they wrote and from the perspective that they wrote. But before we get into some of the details with regard to Luke, let's do what we did, or let's do with this book what we do with the others. Let's give you an outline. And what I've done with the 24 chapters is I've kind of put it into 6 different groups, all right, to kind of give us an idea of how this book is outlined. And again, if you read through the book this week, you may want to keep this outline beside you so that can give you a little more clarity. First 4 chapters, we're talking about the preparation of the Son of Man. And you're going to find the phrase Son of Man in all 6 sections of our outline. The reason why is because this is the title that Luke assigns to Jesus in his gospel. He's called the Son of Man. First 4 chapters talks about the preparation of the Son of Man, talking about not only about his genealogy, but talking about his birth, talking about his childhood, those kinds of things before he gets into and dives into his earthly ministry itself. That's why we call it the preparation of the Son of Man, so that when we get into chapters 5 through 9, we deal with the power of the Son of Man. And what Luke does here now is he uses the life of Christ and what he does in his ministry and how he demonstrates his power, because he's not just the Son of Man, but Luke will also prove in his book that Jesus is indeed God, in the flesh he is deity. We talk then, when we get into chapters 10 through 20, we see here the parables and the principles of the Son of Man. Here's the teaching part of Jesus' ministry as Luke records it for us. And again, with the parables in there, Luke being the most comprehensive book, it will have more parables than all of the other Gospels when we do that comparison. By the time we get to chapter 21, we deal then with the prophecy of the Son of Man. The prophecy of what? Well, where the Old Testament prophets talking about his necessary death, right? This is where Jesus begins to talk with his disciples with regard to the fulfilling of that prophecy, so that by the time we get into chapters 22 and 23, we talk about the passion of the Son of Man. That's the Passion Week, leading up to his arrest, leading up to his death and burial, so that by the time we get to the last and final chapter, chapter 24, we talk about the pinnacle of the Son of Man. That's where he rises from the dead. That's what chapter 24 is about. He's risen from the dead, and Luke takes that opportunity then to not just talk about the rising of Christ, but also his ascension on high. all right? Which then is a natural, we'll talk about this a little later, which is a natural segue then into Luke's other book of the New Testament, right? The book of Acts. Luke also wrote that, and you'll find that the ending of chapter 24 and the beginning of chapter 1 of Acts is very similar, all right? And that's that connecting point. So, 24 chapters split up into 6 spots that kind of give us an overview of what Luke is doing here as he presents to his original reader what the life and ministry of Christ was all about. But before we get into the text, let's begin to talk about the man himself. Let's try to understand who Luke was. That will give us a better idea of why he wrote and how he wrote. So with regard to this man named Luke, when we talk about his birth and his early life, we know that he was born of Greek parents. And because he was born of Greek parents, that gives him a heritage then that makes him probably the only Gentile writer in the New Testament. So that's going to be quite significant, because if he's the only Gentile writer in the New Testament, then we know who the audience is that Luke is wanting to write to, okay? And why that would include some of the detail that he does. And we think that Luke was probably born about the same time as Jesus and Paul. So what this does then is this makes the gospel writer a contemporary of Jesus during his earthly ministry, a contemporary of Paul, especially when Paul makes his transition from being a Pharisee to now being a convert to Christ. Again, remember who wrote the book of Acts? It was Luke. And how much detail does Luke give about Paul's ministry and what it is that he does, right? Especially his conversion. All of this around the time that Luke was living and breathing and on earth. His parents gave him the name Lucas, which is the shortened form, if we really want to get down to some detail now, of the Roman name Lucanus. Okay? So that's why he's named Luke, and he was one who studied for the medical profession. And with that type of education, what that does then is it gives him a penchant for detail, a penchant for research. That's why Luke and its gospel is not only the longest of the New Testament books, but also the most detailed with regard to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. Because he trained for the medical profession, he probably received his education either in Athens or in Tarsus. Tarsus should do something for us. What does this city of Tarsus do for us? What's another connection that we have in the New Testament of a person from Tarsus? Saul, who is Paul, right? Saul of Tarsus, all right? So begin to see the connection there as we continue to see the birth and early life of Luke. What about his conversion? What do we know about it? Well, not a lot. We would assume, because he's a contemporary of Jesus, that even though he was not a disciple of Jesus, remember he's not part of the 12 that is listed for us, he would be one that was around during Jesus' earthly ministry. It's possible that while living in Antioch, he may have been converted under the ministry of Paul. And it's interesting how this is referred to in Acts chapter 11. If you've got your Bible there, let's just quick go up to Acts chapter 11 and just see what Luke records there for us. Luke chapter 11, verse 25, notice what Luke writes. Then Barnabas departed for Tarsus to seek Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. As Luke writes about this, guess who else is there as he writes about this? Luke is there. It's quite possible that may have been during this time that Luke began to understand not only his need for Christ, but through the ministry of Paul, had an opportunity to accept Christ. So, some interesting things there as we take a look at Luke and his possible conversion experience. With regard to Luke's profession, with regard to his ministry, again, we know that he was a physician. Colossians 4:14, what does Paul call him? He calls him Luke, the beloved physician. Okay, so that's why we know that he was a physician. And with that in mind, he probably then studied medicine at what we would now today call the University of Tarsus. There is no University of Tarsus per se, but that's probably where Luke would have received his education. And if that is the case, then he and Paul may have first met at the university. And if that's where they first met, then it's very possible that Paul studied there as well. Why? Because Tarsus is his hometown. This is where Paul would have maybe got his extended education as well. Remember, he was very educated also. He was a Pharisee, right? So they may have been even in the same school together. Not only was Luke a physician, but he was also a historian as well. His interest in history is especially shown by the many historical date lines that you see as you read through the Gospel, where Luke will talk about, the particular year of a particular king during his reign, okay? Those are those historical timelines that Luke puts in his Gospel and tries to help the original reader get a grasp or an understanding of what's happening historically speaking. In fact, it's the Gospel of Luke that we all go back to when we want to really talk now about the details even of Jesus and the Passion Week, and the fact that he was crucified on a Friday, that he rose on a Sunday. How do we know that? There's enough detail in the Gospel of Luke to help us to understand, even down to those finer details. Luke was a historian as well as he was a physician. And he was a writer as well. Let's not forget that, right?
May I ask a question?
You can.
If Luke was a Gentile,
yes,
right, and Paul was a Jew, the university would have been open to both.
Oh yes.
At that time.
Yes, because the university would not be under the Jewish umbrella. It would be under the Roman umbrella, right? So that education would have been for all. Yeah. So then with Luke being a writer, it's considered, of course, to be by many to be a literary masterpiece, and it is. When I first started studying the Koine Greek language, which is the original language which the New Testament was written in, the vocabulary that you study when you go through Luke is far more expansive and difficult than if you were, for example, to read through the Gospel of John and the Greek that he uses there. So Luke's writing is indeed a literary masterpiece. It reveals for us that he was a highly trained composer. He had a very large vocabulary. When he writes with a vivid style. He has a historical outlook when he's writing. And it's obvious that he has the gift of communication in his writing, because it's very clear what it is that he shares with his reader. And so the combination of Luke's Gospel and Acts, what it does then is it makes Luke, the writer, have more content of the New Testament than any other author, even Paul. And when you consider all of the epistles that Paul wrote and the ones that we have preserved for us are in the New Testament, Luke's content with both Luke and Acts is more than even the Apostle Paul. Okay? So, Luke was a physician, he was a historian, he also indeed was a writer, as well as being what we would call today an evangelist and a pastor. Okay? One of those, we could call Luke one of those people that are well gifted, right? We see them in our churches where we are, right? Where we see well-gifted people, often seeming to have more gifts than we have, right? Luke would be an example of that, a well-gifted individual. He was Paul's co-laborer on the apostles' missionary journeys. In fact, Luke was one who remained with Paul right up to the point in which Paul passed from this earth. And how is it that he could be so gifted? How is it that he could be able to do all of these things? How is it that he was able to have all this kind of time? Well, apparently Luke never married, okay? And so, and that's not to be a disparaging remark against marriage. It's just that without that part of his life, he was able to invest, right, into those other things. And so that was Luke and the way in which he lived life. And we thank the Lord for that, of course, because Luke helps us a great deal in understanding the ministry and the life of Christ. Well, before we get to something else, let's talk about Luke's character here. What Luke included and emphasized in his gospel and Acts reveals a lot about the type of man that he was. We see him as one who was kind, humble. Humility is a character that we see in Luke's writing. Joyful, bright, obviously, pious in the sense of his devotion to Christ, and along with that, a gentleness that is not only seen in Luke's writings, but Luke is one who kind of in his talking about Jesus' earthly life brings about the gentleness of Christ as well. Not only his kindness, but also his gentleness. He had also a keen sense of the might, the justice, the holiness of God. And he was also, what we see is, he was a man of prayer. Why? Well, because he was one who reported praise and intercession often in his writings. He would talk about and record for us the prayers of Christ during his earthly ministry. Or he would talk about, for example, Christ praying all night before he came to the choosing of the 12, right? He would talk about Jesus' intercessory prayers for particular individuals during miracles and things like that. And so it seems then that Luke was one who was a man of prayer. And he was also a man of love and sympathy for the underprivileged, for those in what we would call the humble estate. It's in this gospel that we see Luke concentrating on women. We see here Luke concentrating in his writings on children. We see here where Luke concentrates in his writings in referencing people that would be considered in the culture of that day the outcasts, especially the Samaritans, right? What great parable does Jesus talk about that includes a Samaritan in his story? You remember?
The Good Samaritan.
The parable of the Good Samaritan, that's right. Which gospel do you find that in? You find that in Luke, right? That famous parable of the prodigal son, what gospel is that in? That's in Luke, right? What does the prodigal have to work through? He is a social outcast before he returns to his father, right? In the triad of parables in Luke chapter 15, where he not only talks about the lost son or the prodigal son, but the first parable of the triad, he talks about the lost sheep. The second parable, he talks about the parable of the lost coin. The character involved in the story, notice it's a woman, okay, that's involved in that story. All right? So it's interesting how Luke seems to bring those ideas out that, again, make a distinction between his gospel and the other three that we find in the New Testament. The question often is asked, how did Luke die? One tradition says that Luke died as a martyr in Greece. Not everyone is convinced of that. We have an extra-biblical writing. It's called the Anti-Marcionite writing. It's entitled Prologue to Luke. It was written around 170 A.D. So in this sense, we're talking about 100 years after Luke's writing, okay? And in this Anti-Marcionite writing, it says, at the age of 84, he, referring to Luke, fell asleep in Boeotia, full of the Holy Spirit, okay? So according to this writing, Luke died in his sleep, okay? And died a peaceful death. That's all we know, really, about his death. And I would have a tendency to go with more of the falling asleep but not waking up on this side of eternity over the tradition. But we'll know when we get to heaven eventually. We'll be able to ask Luke the direct question, right? How did you die? He'll be able to give us that detail. If we even by that time think it's important to ask. So, with regard to the life of the man Luke, before we go on any further in our discussion here, questions or thoughts that you have to this point with regard to Luke himself? Quite an interesting and intriguing individual. when you begin to scratch below the surface a little bit and find out about him. Let's talk about his authorship, or the authorship of the book of Luke, or the Gospel of Luke. The author of this third Gospel is nowhere named in the book. Luke never names himself in the 24 chapters, okay? But tradition, internal evidence of the text strongly supports Lucan authorship. And because when we take a look at both Luke and Acts, the similarities in the writing, the vocabulary, all the rest of it, it makes it very clear that this indeed is written by Luke himself. Where he wrote the book is unknown. Perhaps Caesarea, perhaps Rome. We don't know for certain. Those are some ideas that are out there. But all intents and purposes, we really don't know. Other than this, that he wrote his gospel around AD 60. Would not be much earlier than writing Acts. Probably at the outside, we would say the time span between Luke writing his gospel and writing Acts may be 1 year or even 18 months at the most. Luke wrote both works fairly close together. So we're saying that Luke wrote his gospel around AD 60, okay? So that would be, about 30 years or so after all of the events of what Luke wrote about with regard to the ministry of Christ, okay? Of course, Luke, when he wrote his book, had sources of information that he used to help him in his writing. He had early access to early written records of the life and ministry of Christ. How do we know this? Well, if you go to chapter 1 of Luke, you'll see where Luke mentions it. Luke chapter 1, and we're starting in verse 1. Notice what Luke writes. Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us. So notice what he says. As many as have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things. He's referring to the sources that have already been written about the earthly ministry of Christ. He goes on, verse 2. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. So in other words, he's talking about these sources that he's using to help him in the writing of the ministry and the life of Christ. He also was involved in interviewing many people who were eyewitnesses to the ministry of Christ. And so Luke almost takes upon himself here the role of what we might call today an investigative reporter. Whereas he's wanting to put the story of Jesus' life together, he's going to use other sources to help him. He's going to do personal interviews with people to make sure that his rendition of the life and ministry of Christ is as accurate as it possibly can be. How more of a medical student can you be, right? And the details and the research that would be involved with regard to that. So that when we get to the original readers of Luke's Gospel now, we find that he wrote this Gospel especially for this friend named Theophilus. We find this in verse 3. Notice what he writes. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus. So now we know who the original reader of this Gospel was. His name was Theophilus. And what we know about him is not a lot. He may have been an influential Christian layman of Greece. He possibly even may have been a convert of Luke as he was ministering in the church. We don't know for certain, but some possibilities there. So that when Luke's gospel was circulating throughout the Roman Empire in the first century, what's happening here is that the readers are particularly attracted to it because of the Greek culture. Remember who Luke is writing to. He's writing to a Greek. He's writing to Theophilus. And this Greek culture during Luke's and Theophilus' day was the culture that glorified wisdom, glorified beauty, glorified the ideal man, right? The perfect specimen of humanity. These were all of the things that the Greek culture worshipped. And so when Luke is writing his gospel, he had all people in mind when he wrote this gospel, which is one of the reasons why he gives the title of Jesus, Son of Man, and why it appears throughout the book. He's relating the fact that Jesus is the Son of Man in the sense that as God, he identifies with humanity. He identifies with humanity, and we will see as we go throughout the gospel that Jesus identifies with humanity right through to the very point that God in the flesh even dies like a human. But what's distinct now, and what's the glorifying part of all of this, remember, the glory of the Greek culture, right? What humanity cannot do, God does. He not only dies, but he now rises from the dead. That's the distinguishing mark. That's the pinnacle, as we said in our outline, the pinnacle now of the Son of Man. This God who identifies with humanity is the pinnacle or the supreme example now of what humanity can be through Christ. Hence this title that Luke gives him, the Son of Man. It's also the reason why Luke as well traces Jesus' genealogy back to Adam, not just to Abraham. Remember, Matthew traced Jesus' genealogy back to Abraham and stopped there. What Luke does is he traces Jesus' genealogy all the way back to Adam. Because what does Adam represent? The first human being that God created. Okay? So we see now this inclusion that Luke wants to bring in his writing. Jesus is not just God come in the flesh for the Jewish people. Jesus is God in the flesh come for humanity as a whole. Okay? Which brings about the distinction of his gospel. That's why when we begin to talk then about the purpose and the theme of Luke, that he states his purpose clearly in the first 4 verses of chapter 1. He's wanting to write a consecutive chronological account for the full and exact truth of Jesus' ministry. Well, basically, Luke writes to Theophilus in the first 4 verses. He's saying there's all kinds of sources out there with regard to the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. What I'm going to give you, Theophilus, is the exact truth of what's going on. You can take my text and compare it to all the other texts that are out there. This is going to be the real deal. This is the real story. This is accurate. This is backed up. This is all that you need to know about the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ. That's why, as we talk about the theme of Luke, it concerns Jesus of Nazareth, who is a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, as is written in chapter 24, in verse 19. And so what Luke then does is he emphasizes what we would call the universality of salvation. What we mean by that is salvation by Christ is available to all, not just to a certain sect or ethnic background. But the salvation of Jesus is available and permissible for all. And the word faith appears often in this gospel because faith is what is required in this salvation that Jesus provides to all humanity. Questions, comments there as we deal with Luke in its general form.
He's a perfectionist.
Medical doctor, I would certainly hope so.
Yeah, but in every facet, bringing it all together from every possible detail and every possible historical event, every possible the beginning of Christ.
Yeah.
Like everything.
Everything's there. Yeah. Everything is there that we need. And the reliability of it is ironclad. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Not to say that the reliability of Matthew and Mark isn't ironclad. Don't get me wrong. But Luke does his homework. in the production of this gospel.
Well, especially when you consider that he wasn't part of it.
He wasn't one of the disciples. That's right, yeah. Matthew was, but not Luke.
Very much for detail.
Yes, and that's why it's the longest of the books, because Luke takes time to go through the detail. Especially when you read about, and this is one of those tip-offs of the writer being a physician. When you look through the details of his beating, before his crucifixion, when you talk about the details of his death and the details of his resurrection, Luke becomes very detailed in all of that facet of Jesus' earthly ministry. Why? Because these are the things that physicians are interested in, right? The human body and its response to the types of things that the body goes through, especially under trauma like a crucifixion. How do you explain to a physical doctor or to a physician? How do you explain to a physician about the reality of rising from the dead? Okay, these are things that intrigue Luke, and he wants to research it even further. That's why we have the detail that we have. So a remarkable gospel. There's some prominent subjects that Luke deals with. And one of the things that he deals with, and will deal with first, is what he calls the perfect humanity of Christ. Remember, Son of Man, that phrase that Luke uses to help bring about the identification of Jesus with humanity. We know that humanity, as glorified as he may be in the Greek culture, is still not perfect. Except when we come to this one, Jesus Christ. He's the example of what it means to realize the perfection of humanity, the perfect humanity of Christ. Because even though Luke presents Jesus indeed as the Son of God, we see that in verse 35 of his first chapter. Notice what he writes. And the angel answered and said to her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the highest will overshadow you. Therefore also the Holy One who is to be born will be called the Son of God. The angelic proclamation to Mary, who would be the birth mother of Jesus. He's coming into this world as a human being, but Luke shows him especially as, again, the Son of Man. This gospel is the fullest account of the birth, the childhood, and the domestic and social life of Jesus. And in all of that, what Luke does then is he underscores his human feelings. He underscores many of his social contacts and how that works out. And so we see the full gamut in Luke's writing of the human emotion that Jesus displays. We see Jesus joyful. We see Jesus sad. We see Jesus compassionate. We see Jesus angry. We see all of the gamuts of the human emotions because this is all part of the human existence. And what Luke does then is he talks about Christ being the perfect example of what a perfect human looks like. Not just in his earthly ministry, but even before his earthly ministry. That's why he talks about his birth. That's why he talks about his childhood. The prayers of Jesus are prominent throughout the book, which, again, emphasize Jesus' humanity. It's interesting that prayer is not something that is just reserved for the human existence. No, God himself prays. And Luke makes sure that we see that in this human factor of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus is recorded by Luke. Also identifies Jesus intimately, again, with the human race, because he, again, traces his descendants all the way back to Adam. Luke emphasizes this in his gospel. You want to see the perfect specimen of humanity, thinking about the Greek mindset? You want to see the perfect specimen of humanity? Take a look at Jesus. He's the only example. The only example, the only perfect specimen of humanity. Now, fortunately, Luke just doesn't talk about that. He also talks about praise and thanksgiving. As you go throughout and look for this as you read through Luke, you'll see the instances of praise to God for this ministry that is taking place. Not just the praise of the people, but you'll also see at times where Jesus is giving praise. You'll see times where Jesus is giving thanks for how the Father is responding to the needs of his ministry and to the needs of people that he ministers to. So there's not only this perfect specimen of humanity, but also this element of the humanity of Christ as well, where we see his praise and we see his thanksgiving. There is an obvious historical perspective that Luke concentrates on in his book, the factual basis of the gospel. What we mean by that is that this gospel is not just a story. This gospel covers the facts in relation to Jesus' earthly ministry. So the factual basis of the gospel is underscored by, again, the inclusion of many references to dates, many references to the secular rumors that are going on during these days. And even when you take a look at the organization of the book, it has a historical perspective. Again, Luke talks about the chronological order that he will relate to us about the life of Christ. That's why he starts at the beginning with his birth. Talks about his childhood after that. He doesn't give us a lot of detail about his childhood, but gives us a little bit of insight into it. And then runs us into his earthly ministry. But as he talks about his earthly ministry, we'll go through that in a chronological order as well, up to the final resurrection and ascension. Luke also does something interesting here as well. He compares and he relates for us in the first 4 chapters the ministries of John the Baptist and Jesus. Remember who John the Baptist was? He was in the family tree perspective, he was a cousin to Jesus. In fact, John was born mere months prior to the birth of Jesus. And what you'll find Luke doing as he talks about the ministries of John the Baptist and Jesus is that he interweaves the stories of John and Jesus, and it's all for one purpose. It magnifies Jesus. That's why you find John the Baptist saying in Luke about the fact that it's necessary that Jesus increase and John himself decrease. Right? Luke interweaves those stories all to magnify Jesus as being, again, the supreme example of what it is to be a God in the flesh, living and identifying with the human condition. Of course, it's here in Luke where we have the Christmas story. Of all of the details that you want to know about the birth of Christ, the Gospel of Luke is where you go. Matthew helps to supplement that, of course, but Luke is the one that brings us that Christmas story that we're so familiar with. And the particular reporting of Jesus' birth in this sense appears only in Luke's Gospel. You won't find the birth of Christ talked about in Mark because he doesn't deal with it. Same with John, he doesn't deal with it either. Luke is the one that deals with it, and then Matthew gives us a little bit more of insight as we compare it to Luke's recording of the birth of Christ. Jesus identifies himself in Luke's Gospel by his miracles. That is the one way in which Jesus identified himself as being the Son of Man, right? Identifying the human condition, but not just being a human being. He is God in the flesh, right? His power, his ability is displayed through his miracles. It demonstrates in particular the fact that we're not just talking about a man. We're talking about the God-man. We're talking about the Son of Man. We're talking about God in the flesh. There are 20 miracles that are recorded in Luke's Gospel. 6 of them are unique to when you compare all the miracles that are told about Christ. Of the 20 that are shared in Luke, 6 of them are unique to the Gospel of Luke. Right? So here's a little project for you. read through the Gospels, record all of the miracles of Christ, and see which 6 are unique to Luke only. All right? If you've ever wondered what there is to study in the Bible, there's an idea for you. Okay? Which miracles are unique, which of Jesus' miracles are unique to Luke only in comparison to all the other of the 4 Gospels? That'll keep you going for a little while if you're looking for something to do. His instruction by parables, a very large section of the Gospel of Luke, deals with Jesus' teaching in the way of parables. 35 parables alone in the Gospel, okay? In the Gospels themselves, there's 35 parables recorded. Of those 35, 19 of them are unique to Luke. Okay? So that's a major portion. So again, if you're looking for something to do after you found those 6 unique miracles, what are the 19 unique parables, okay, that Jesus talks about in Luke that aren't talked about in the other Gospels? Of course, Jesus teaches about the kingdom. It takes a couple of chapters, in fact, to kind of work that through. It's one of the important subjects of Jesus' teaching, of course, the kingdom. And when Jesus is talking about the kingdom, what he has in mind is this, what we would call this larger kingdom. What we mean by that is we're talking about the large, universal nature of the kingdom itself as it relates to the gospel. It exists, and what Jesus talks about when he's talking about the kingdom during his earthly ministry, he's talking about the kingdom that exists now, the one that he brings now, right? Remember the Sermon on the Mount back in Matthew where Jesus talks about the kingdom, the characteristics of living in the kingdom, what it means to be a kingdom resident, okay? That's the kingdom, pardon me, that Jesus was talking about. He's talking about this gospel kingdom, okay? There's still a kingdom that he's going to develop later on in the future when he comes again. But the kingdom now that exists now, because Christ is present on the earth now, that's the kingdom that Jesus is talking about. And he also, or Luke also concentrates on this in his gospel. And the reason for this is because there were many of Jesus' contemporaries that had false views about the kingdom. And so what Jesus had to do then was bring about some instruction concerning it to help them understand what kingdom he was talking about. Unfortunately, they didn't all understand it. In fact, sometimes we even still struggle with it. But these were the instructions that Jesus was giving for our benefit. Of course, Luke talks about the great sacrifice, his death and his burial, which then brings us to the final chapter where we talk about the grand miracle where he is risen from the dead and he ascends to the right hand of the Father on high. Some other prominent subjects with regard to Luke. Well, the work of Christ in redemption. Luke makes sure that that is very clear for us. The work of the Holy Spirit. In Luke, the Holy Spirit is referred to more often in Luke than Matthew and Mark combined. Okay? So as you've heard me say this before, if something keeps being repeated in Scripture, it's probably important to take note of if it keeps being repeated. So yeah, Luke talks about the Holy Spirit more often in his gospel than in Matthew and Mark combined. It's going to be in Luke's gospel where we see Christ's ministry to the Gentiles, not just to the Jews, as Matthew covers it, but also especially to the Gentiles, because this again is going to be fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Again, something that's unique to Luke. He concentrates on the needs of, again, what we would call the humble estate, where he talks about in his rendition of Jesus' earthly ministry, he talks about women, he talks about children, he talks about the outcasts. Why? Because in Jesus' and Luke's day, in the culture of that day, women were viewed far different in that culture than they are in our North American Western context today. Children were viewed far different than they are today as well. Children, as well as women, in a lot of circles were considered to be more property than they were family. Okay? Luke brings about a distinction, a new viewpoint with regard to these people, and uses the ministry of Christ to emphasize that. And again, the outcasts, the Samaritans, for example, appear often in Luke's story. In fact, women are mentioned in all but 5 of the 24 chapters of Luke. Isn't that interesting? I think there's a purpose behind this. And part of the purpose behind that is the fact that it was the ministry of Jesus, and Luke is pointing this out, it's the ministry of Jesus that brings women into a whole new light and a whole new perspective and how we need to respond to women. Okay? Jesus is the one who brings about change in that, and Luke is the one who brings that point about. And it's quite interesting to see how he does that. The various identifications of Jesus are that which Luke concentrates on. Again, this title, Son of Man, it's unique to Luke. The Emmaus story. Do you know what I mean by the Emmaus story? Remember the 2 disciples that after the death of Christ are on the way, right? And Luke catches up, or not Luke, but Jesus catches up with them on the road, right? And they don't recognize him at first. Luke is unique in that story. That's the only gospel that has that story. After Christ is risen from the dead. Again, the medical terms, the descriptions with medical interest, all used to support the authorship by a physician. Angels as well is something that's unique to the Gospel of Luke. You'll see more references to angels in this Gospel than in the other 3. Okay? And so Luke brings that about. There are some short passages as well that are found only in Luke that include such things as Christ weeping over Jerusalem. You only find that in Luke. You will not find that in Matthew, Mark, and John. Remember the description of Jesus' sweat as great drops of blood in the Garden of Gethsemane? Only mentioned in Luke. You won't find it in the other Gospels. The mercy to the thief on the cross. Today you will be with me in paradise, Jesus says. You only find that in the Gospel of Luke. You don't find it in any of the Gospels. Isn't that interesting? All relating back again to the humility that Luke shows about Christ, his compassion, his mercy on the outcasts, right? The thief on the cross. Nobody else cared about him. Why should he? But he does, right? And the words of Christ are prominent in Luke's gospel as well. What we mean by that is this. About half of all of the verses in the Gospel of Luke, there's something like, I think it's just something like 1,153 verses total in the Gospel of Luke. Almost half of them contain Christ's words. Okay? So half of the Gospel of Luke, basically half the Gospel of Luke, are all the words of Christ as he experiences life and as Luke records it for us. So when we begin to tear it all down and we begin to take a look below the surface a little bit in the Gospel of Luke, we find that this Gospel of the 4 is seemingly the most significant to this stage anyway in our study, right? This is not just any gospel, this is the gospel, okay, of the 4 that we're looking at. Questions, comments there before we go on?
I always find it interesting when that thief on the cross, this is the only one where Jesus said he'll be with him in paradise. The others just have them as mocking and that's...
Yes, yeah.
You know, I can never understand why doesn't it mention that. It's really important.
Yeah.
It must have been for him, as he was doing his investigation of the entire life of Christ and his death and resurrection. to get close enough, said a witness close enough to see the sweat.
Yeah. Somebody was there because,
Things like that,
because
somebody had to-
Luke wasn't.
Had to be a witness, a
Yep.
believer. Do you think it had to be a believer?
Probably one of the disciples that was with him in the garden. And Luke is the only one that records it in his gospel. Mhm. Because Luke wasn't there. Remember, he wasn't one of the disciples. Yeah. All right. With all that we know so far about the Gospel of Luke, what does that mean for us? So what? Right? What does it mean for us? 4 things I think are important for us to be reminded of or to consider. First of all, let's consider this. Luke and his gospel remind us of our deep gratitude and joy over Christ and his work on our behalf. Let's remember again why Luke wrote what he wrote. He wanted Theophilus to have the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, regarding the earthly ministry of Christ and what it is that Jesus did. Not just for Theophilus, but what Jesus did for Luke and what Jesus did for any and all of humanity. What this should do for us as we read it through, and as Luke goes into the detail and to the length of the descriptions that he does about what Jesus has done, should indeed fill us with what I call deep gratitude and joy. This did not happen by accident. This was on purpose. What Jesus did, and what Luke records about what Jesus did, he did intentionally. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't by happenstance. It wasn't by chance. It was the direct intention of God to do what it is that he did. And the direct intention of God to go to the lengths that he did in order to accomplish redemption for us. Luke gives us the whole enchilada on it. And that should indeed cause us to be filled with this, what we call this deep gratitude and joy. Because this is what Christ did for me. This is what Christ did for you. That's why it is important to magnify Christ in all our ways. That's what Luke emphasizes in his gospel about Christ. Since Christ has done this, that's why we magnify him. That's why we praise him. That's why we thank him. That's why you see examples in the gospel as you follow the story of Christ, as Christ responds to their need. What do we find? We find snippets where Luke records about people coming back to Jesus and saying, thank you, thank you, thank you for what you've done. Lack of gratitude means lack of magnification of the glory of Christ. Lack of praise means that Christ is not glorified to the extent that he should and could be. What Luke reminds us of is the necessity, the essential nature of the human being to be magnifying Christ in all that we do, in all that we say, in all that we think. Because again, what Christ did for us, as he identified with the human condition, as he identified with humanity itself, this was intentionally done by God himself. How else could we respond when we begin to recognize the depths to what Christ has done? We also learn lessons about humility from Jesus, because that is a quality that is made prominent in Luke. Look for that as you read through it. those places, those instances where Luke will make a statement in a verse that relates, again, the humility of Christ. Where rather than responding the way in which we think he could or should, he responds totally different than maybe to how we would respond to a particular situation or circumstance. We see Christ as one who is humble. It's a prominent quality that Luke brings about. Because in the Greek mindset, humility is a weakness. But what humanity has to understand is the strength and the power that comes through humility. And Jesus is the one that gives us that example of the strength of character that comes along with humility. We also learn lessons about our relationships with people of low estate. Luke, at times, when we read it from this perspective, can kind of begin to be a bit of a kind of start to meddle in our responses and our thoughts with regard to those that we have a tendency to view as a little less than ourselves, perhaps. Jesus' response to those in his culture, in his society, was far different from how the rest of society responded to these individuals. And perhaps it would humble us or challenge us with regard to our response to people in our culture, people in our society, that we would have a tendency to treat a little different because they are different. They don't have the same position or the same socioeconomic status that you and I have. We find Jesus' response to these type of people refreshing in one sense, but challenging in another. Challenging us in how we respond. Well, if you haven't caught on to it yet, of all of the four Gospels, Luke is my favorite. Not to say that the others are substandard, by no means. But here's the pinnacle. Here's the whole ball of wax. If we want to find out about the ministry of Christ during his earthly days, here's where we go. We use John and Mark and Matthew to help us along the way with regard to it. But here's where we're going to get all of it in the detail that we need and want, and sometimes even more detail than we want. Here's where we find out about Jesus, especially as he identifies with me in my human condition. That's why I think it's my favorite, because I see Jesus identifying with me. And I trust as you read it this week, you'll find Jesus identifying with you. Let's pray. Father, thanks again for your word. Thank you for this gospel, the way in which it shares about your ministry as you spent time with us here on earth. Fathers who read again, help us to read with eyes that are open, perhaps a little wider, a little further, with minds that are ready to take in things that we perhaps have not seen before or need to be reminded of. Father, may this book reintroduce us again to you. And may our response be that which magnifies and glorifies you. Thank you for it. Go with us as we go from this place. We pray in Jesus' name.